Have South African ports and authorities been absorbed into the heroin economy? Well, that's the question, as a report suggests that Durban and Cape Town ports are becoming a den for heroin trafficking. According to the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime, since 2015, the heroin market in the country has grown substantially. Senior advisor at the group, Peter Gastrow, joins us now from Cape Town studio. Peter, good evening. Perhaps the first point of call should be around, firstly, this a southern route and how heroin actually travels. Tell us more about the highway of impunity, as it's called.
Well, the poppies are planted and reaped in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and then shipped down in dhows down the East African coast. It's a long way, but it's relatively low risk for them. It's then dropped in numerous places along the coast of Kenya, very much in Tanzania, and even more so in Mozambique. And from there, a lot of it is transported by rail to South Africa across borders, and some of it, it seems, comes through harbors as well. So the impunity is a word which has been used because until now it's been relatively risk-free. The law enforcement and naval authorities just are not equipped to deal with that in a way which puts off the heroin traffickers.
As far as patterns are concerned, and you've mentioned quite a number of countries that this heroin would have to travel through, what have you found as the connection between how drug traffickers are able to move their shipments around and the kind of associations that they would need to have with local authorities before we bring it home to South Africa?
Well, we found that in Kenya, in Tanzania, includes Zanzibar, and very much so in Mozambique, there's been a long-standing relationship between government authorities, harbour authorities, transport authorities, and the criminal networks and their leaders. An arrangement very often which seems to involve providing security for the road traffic of heroin to the borders on the one hand, and on the other hand, the arrangement seems to be that money will change and be passed on to the government authorities or political parties. This is something very common. It's not yet as developed in South Africa, but along the other East African coasts, it's not new. It's common knowledge. It's been going on for some time.
Given the fact that the heroin market in the country has grown substantially, as your research has found, what are the trends then that you are noting in terms of how these drugs make their way through the different cities? And you specifically highlight Durban, Cape Town, and those towns that are along the N7 highway.
We found that along those routes which are used to traffic the heroin, for example, the road from Durban to Johannesburg, some of it is left behind and is distributed in towns along those routes. We know for a fact it's serious problems in Witbank and Middelburg, but also in the harbour areas. There are smaller amounts that are distributed, and it involves not only South Africans, it also involves people who are involved from Tanzania. Now, the expansion of the use and addiction from heroin has been quiet, but it has been quite dramatic. And that is because it is not consumed under the name heroin. It's got different names in different parts of the country. In Durban, in Chatsworth, it's called sugar, as you may know. In Cape Town, they call it unga. In Johannesburg, nyope. Now, all those names refer to a substance of which the basic ingredient is heroin, which makes it very addictive. So consumption has gone up without heroin being blamed. And it mainly happens in very poor relatively voiceless communities who fall victims to this along the main road of trafficking and in the harbour cities.
And of course, much of this information would then change the kind of approach that we are seeing from local authorities to the fight against drug use. But you also find that South Africa's response in particular is rather conservative and punitive when it comes to dealing with substance abuse. Why?
Yes, it is a really outdated approach of viewing the user who's become an addict as a criminal almost. It's criminalized. Instead of adopting a more progressive view which says, how can we turn this around through a medical approach? And I must say, in Kenya and in Tanzania, for example, there have been significant changes for the better in the way in which authorities deal with addicts and with users. We have a lot of catching up to do in South Africa because we not only sideline them, we push them into the criminal camp, which makes it worse, and entire communities keep quiet and are affected by it as though the problem doesn't exist. People are embarrassed by a relative being an addict. They don't go to clinic to try and get medical treatment for that.
And so certainly how we approach things could be much more different. In terms of patterns, you've said that South Africa, when it comes to the associations of political elites in terms of ensuring that this, the movement of drugs is much easier, as we see in Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique. You say that it's not necessarily as extensive in South Africa, but you have found that our ports, particularly in Durban, are used for trafficking. Are authorities responding to this?
Well, that's difficult for us to say. We are aware that law enforcement, police, are concerned about it in Durban and in Cape Town. We know, for example, that a very large shipment of heroin recently, a few months ago, towards the end of last year, almost a ton, was going to be sent through the Cape Town harbour to Europe, the Netherlands, I believe. Now, that is something which I think caught everyone by surprise, including the law enforcement people. So a lot of, I think, waking up and catching up needs to be done by our law enforcement people, but it's also something which requires a broader strategy where you cooperate with law enforcement from other countries. The whole East African coastal region is a region of trade, is a market for the criminal networks. They don't recognize the borders. Whereas very often law enforcement still responds within their own boundaries. We need to cooperate and collaborate with Mozambique, Tanzania, Kenya, jointly tackle this, these networks who operate for some time already across all those borders. So there's a lot of work to be done also on the medical response, on the health response, as well as from law enforcement and government policy side.
And when it comes to these networks which you've spoken about, do you find that they operate mainly with a base in South Africa, or are they just, international, as it were, that it would be difficult for authorities to trace them to some of the local, perhaps better known gang leaders?
It would be difficult. We're dealing with very sophisticated criminal entrepreneurs. They're not stupid. And they have very strong international links. It would be wrong to say that they are South Africa-based, but certainly there are parts of those networks which are based here, which ensure that the trafficking of heroin through this country on its way to Europe and to the East happens without incident. But the network leaders are found also in Mozambique, particularly in northern Mozambique and in Kenya, as well as in Afghanistan and Pakistan, as well as in the Netherlands and Belgium. So we're talking about international networks, which makes it a prerequisite that international law enforcement cooperation takes place in order to identify and apprehend these people. I think court cases and newspaper reports about street corner drug transactions, of course it has to happen. We have to watch that. But that doesn't touch the problem. We need to move to the kingpins, to the international ones who deal with large volumes of heroin, traveling through South Africa to Europe, but also increasingly being used within the country, devastating some societies.
And it certainly hits home when you look at the impact that it has on our communities, especially young people, many of whom are unemployed in some of these towns which you have spoken about. Thank you for bringing us into the picture here, a senior advisor at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime, Peter Gastrow.